Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Welcome, one and all. I'm absolutely delighted this evening to be joined by Spencer from the Cocoa Runners. Cheers, Spencer. Good evening.
Cheers, and good evening to you. Lovely to be here, and great to be sort of seeing you in all the glory. I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Spencer, for giving us your Friday evening. I know that members will really appreciate it. We did one of these last year. It was a huge success, and fingers crossed. I've done the pairings this evening. You had Catherine with you last year, so hopefully members will enjoy them. I will run through a small bit of housekeeping before we start. Very, very easy. Hopefully most of you have joined us on Zoom before. I'm Anna, and I'm from the Tastings and Events team. I'll be hosting this evening along with Spencer. So I'll be on wine, Spencer will be on chocolate. And behind the scenes tonight, we have Catherine, also from the Wine Society Tastings team. And Catherine is going to be on hand managing your questions. So if you have questions, please pop those in the Q&A button. And Catherine will also be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any thoughts, particularly about the pairings, but of course, if you just want to let us know where you are and what you're drinking, then Catherine will be on hand to answer those as well. We've also got quite a few slides. So she's going to be busy bee this evening. So we've got a few slides as well to talk you through. I know Spencer's got some great information on chocolate tasting, and we'll talk a bit about the wines, obviously, as well. And then all that I suppose the last thing to say is if you are having any technical troubles at all, please, please, please don't suffer in silence. If you can't even access the chat, then the best thing to do is email us on tastings@thewinesociety.com, and Catherine or I will pick up your email behind the scenes. So I suppose without further ado, we've got 4 wines and 6 chocolates to try this evening. So I'm going to give the floor over to Spencer to get started. I promise you we're going to try and keep on time. We've got 1 hour to spend with you lovely members. So I'm going to hand straight over to Spencer, who's hopefully going to give us a little introduction on how to taste chocolate. So thank you, Spencer.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much, all members of the Wine Society, which I'm delighted to have been a long-term member of. And I think it's the most wonderful thing, and I'm delighted to be doing chocolate with it again here tonight. So as Anna sort of said, Anna's come up with a range of amazing pairings, and they really, I think, actually are fantastic. And they're also fantastic wines and some quite fun chocolates. But we thought the first thing we would do, because you're all Wine Society guys, and a few of you may be chocolate guys, but basically, as you're all Wine Society guys, you all know how to sort of, taste wine and go very well on that. So what we thought we'd actually have a go at is talking to you a little bit about how to taste chocolate. So what we'd like you to do is grab one of the small Cru Virunga, and just one other quick heads up, we've given you lots of tasting bars so that we can get more chocolate varieties to you, and we'll explain to you how those all work in just a sec. But we'd love you to sort of grab one of those, and then because I've got Anna here with me, Anna unfortunately is the sort of the live model for what we need to do. So you're all sort of quite used to basically, I think, sort of tasting wines, as I sort of said, with chocolate. What you want to do is open it up and have a look at it. So that's a little bit like when you sort of, look at a glass of wine and you sort of, swirl it around, you have a look and you sort of make sure you've got the color and everything else like that. The same thing is true of chocolate. But chocolate's got one other thing that we want you to do with it, which is slightly different to what you're used to doing, which is actually the most important thing you can do with chocolate after giving it a good sniff, is to hold it up to your ear and then snap it. And you should get a very loud snap. So I'm going to break it again, and you should just hear that snap. And that snap basically means that the chocolate has been well tempered. And we're going to use this to explain a little bit about how chocolate releases its flavors and its tastes. So you're all with me. Snap it, hold it up to your ear, and this is what you should be doing going forward, always when you get a piece of chocolate. And then what I'd love you to do, and this is where Anna again is going to be, acting as my sort of, the person who's going to be demonstrating this much better than I am. If you grab a small piece of the chocolate, what I'd love you to do is, before you put it in your mouths, I'd love you to please hold your noses. So hold your nose, and then just take a piece of chocolate and just put it in your mouth and just suck it. And what you should discover is A, that you won't asphyxiate, but B, you may get a little bit of sweetness, but you won't get a lot else. You won't get a lot of anything else. If you just hold it there, you're allowed to chew it a bit. Give it about another 3 or 4 seconds, but just hold the chocolate in your mouth, chew it, suck it, play with it any which way you want. And then what I'd love you to do, please, is I'm going to count to 3, and then I'd love you to release your noses and pretend you've run 100 meters. 1, 2, 3. And what should suddenly happen is you should suddenly be accosted by a whole range of aromas and flavors and a little bit more taste. But what it's showing you, which is, I mean, you guys are all into wine, so you will get the difference between what we call retronasal and orthonasal olfaction, which is a fancy way of saying that human beings are unique in being able to detect flavor, not just by smelling through our noses, but also when we put something in our mouths, it releases all the flavors and it releases all the aromas. And that's what we're really trying to get you to do here. So obviously you get all the taste, which, as you all know, taste are things you get from receptors which are in your mouth, in your gut, and everywhere in between. So there are things like sweetness, sourness, bitterness, saltiness, umami, fattiness, etc. But what's amazing about wines and what's amazing about chocolate is that they also have these aromas and these flavors, which only human beings can really get when you put something in our mouths, because we lack something called the transverse lambda. But anyway, all I'm really just doing is just saying, when you taste your chocolate, let it melt in your mouth. And then the other thing I'd love to do is basically get you to go a bit on a journey. So we think about this as being a bit like when you go surfing in the sea. So if you look at the page which we've given you, and you've got it here, Catherine's showing it to you, you should all have a picture of a wave, which was actually developed by some wine people with the Wine Society and other people. And you sort of get this in wine too, but in chocolate's case, most people just sort of scoff chocolate. And what we'd love you to try and do is actually to savor it a bit. So step one is think a bit about the texture. So, you know, is it smooth? Is it grainy? Is it velvety? Is it silky, etc.? And then as the wave crashes over you, that's what we mean by when the chocolate melts and it starts to release some of the volatiles, those are the aromas. And the other thing which we find with chocolate, and I guess it's true a little bit of wine too, is that whereas with colors, we're all very used to being able to articulate colors and describe what's red, what's blue, what's green. Often we've got this sort of flavor on the tip of our tongue and we can't sort of quite describe it. So we've just put some words here which may or may not help you. But then afterwards, what you'll get, and this, we borrowed this unashamedly from the Wine Society and all of its sort of great educational stuff, is that, you know, a great wine should have balance and length and intensity and complexity. And we think the same is true of chocolate. So hopefully, as you sort of taste these different chocolates and as we go through it, we'd love you to sort of think, you know, what's the texture like? Then what are the initial aromas like? What are the other flavors? What are the other tastes I'm getting? And then just think a little bit about, you know, actually, does it have balance? Do I get some other flavors? What's the complexity coming through here? And as we do the pairings, we'll talk a bit more about how that stuff works there too. So great. I think we're, yeah.
Fantastic, Spencer. Thank you. Yeah, I like how you said people scoff chocolate. I think the same is true of wine. I think life's indulgences, it's very easy to enjoy them so quickly and not think about them. And yes, it's an incredibly easy thing to do. We had an event yesterday evening where we talked about wines that you don't need to think about and wines that really do need some thought. There's pleasure in both for sure, but I think the nice thing about a chocolate and wine pairing is Spencer and I, between the two of us, are going to force a little bit of thinking in the nicest possible way. It's a Friday evening. We're not going to force studying to a degree, but we are going to force a little bit of light thinking and make you sort of question and think about what you're tasting. So I think with that in mind, for those of you who are tasting along wine-wise this evening, hopefully you have 4 wines. I would recommend, if you haven't already, the only wine that really could do with a little bit more oxygen is the second wine. So our G2, our Chilean Carmenere blend. If you haven't poured it, it's not the end of the world. That's what the swirl is for. Fear not. But if you do have chance now and you have a spare glass, I would recommend pouring that wine because the oxygen's gonna do it lots and lots of favors. So let's go with wine number 1. Now, wine number 1 is, and I'll just show you the bottle, but I think we do have a screen grab if anybody's tasting my numbers, as it were, and having a look. But wine number 1 is, it's a Bourgueil and it's called Passion, and it's made by a producer called Joël Taluau, 2020 vintage. And Bourgueil is a region within the Loire Valley. It is a region that specializes, I would say, in Cabernet Franc. And when Spencer had sort of suggested some chocolates, he said Cabernet Franc is really, really lovely with the particular chocolate we're going to talk about. And I will be honest, I went through a few Cabernet Francs before I found this one. We sort of talked about the need to have something fruity, which this wine certainly is. But it needed to have enough substance as well. And believe me, it was a fun experiment trying to find the wine that I wanted. But I went to South Africa, which is also good for Cabernet Franc. I actually tried a US Cabernet Franc based wine, but I came back to the heartland of Cabernet Franc, which is the Loire Valley. And this particular producer is a Cabernet Franc specialist. They actually only produce wines made with Cabernet Franc. It's only 32 hectares. Most of it is actually in Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil, which is a sort of slightly aromatic, slightly more aromatic Cabernet Franc. Some people say the soils are slightly different. But they do have 7 hectares in the Bourgueil appellation as well. It's run by a pair called Thierry and Veronique, and they are aided by their children. And I believe we're talking 3rd generation of vineyard, these particular owners of this domain, but that the family have been farming for 6 generations, farming vines. They make 2 wines in particular that we work with. There's one called the L'Expression, which is a Saint-Nicolas de Bourgueil. And those are sort of older vines, kind of 35 years-ish. These are from younger vines, the Passion. And actually, it's made in a sort of fresher and earlier drinking style. So it's meant to be fruity. And I think that's why I really enjoyed it more with the chocolate. For anyone who's interested, they are actually also quite a natural. I hasten to use the word natural. I don't like using it because there's no legal definition, but they certainly produce wines in quite a natural style. So they have these beautiful south-facing slopes. Now, for anyone who's been to the Loire or has drunk Cabernet Franc from the Loire before, they might know that it had a tendency previously to be quite green and austere. Now, the south-facing slopes are going to be really important in making sure that our grapes get fully ripe. So we're not going to have any green flavors here. And the green flavors that we do are not under ripeness. They're the natural green pyrazines from Cabernet Franc. So they're there beautifully on purpose. But instead, we should be having really big, juicy fruit flavors, some nice soft tannins as well. The soils here are a chalky clay, so generally quite a light wine coming from that chalk, but the clay helps warm the roots and preserve water as well. And they do beautiful things here. So they let vegetation grow in between the vines. They only treat the vines when absolutely necessary. So they sort of work in a tendency towards a natural process, even if I don't like to use the word. So having a quick taste, we'll have a smell first. So I'm swirling. And the reason I'm swirling is I want to release some of those aromas. And when I have a smell, a lovely long smell in the wine, it's very berry. I always find a bit strange saying that, but loads and loads of sort of blueberry, cranberry, black currant. It's really black currant for me. And a tiny touch of that leafy aroma that's so beautiful in Cabernet Franc. I think when it is underripe, it can feel sort of almost green peppery or I don't know, maybe a little bit like rocket almost, as in salad rocket, whereas this doesn't feel like that. This feels slightly leafy, but certainly more fruity. So when I taste, I'm going to swirl it around the mouth, and I'm just going to have a quick swirl now. So beautiful high acidity. Cabernet Franc's great at that. It's very refreshing. And I think when we go on to having it with the chocolate, I think that refreshing sort of mouth-watering acidity is really going to aid in the pairing. The tannins are present, but they're not grainy. They're not sort of coarse. They're really light. I probably wouldn't say silky, but they're certainly on the lighter end. And the body feels quite light and refreshing as well. Tannins aren't always, or certainly big tannins aren't always the best friend of chocolate. They can be, but it can make them harder to pair. So I think for me, that's one of the reasons I ended up picking this Loire style. Light, refreshing, fruity, and a bit of an all-round winner for me. So Spencer, let's talk about the chocolate so people compare them together.
Yes, well, first of all, congratulations on an amazing value, I have to say. I think it's the most amazing value of wine too. I mean, it is delicious. And I'm always sort of envious and slightly nervous about the articulacy which with Anna and Catherine both can describe all their wines. We're not as good at it in the chocolate world, but I will give it a whack. So we're going to try basically a chocolate from Sweden made by a guy called Fredrik Martinsson. And it's called Urubamba, which don't worry about. There's an easier way of pronouncing it, which is chuncho, but we're going to come on to that in a sec. But these are Peruvian beans. They're from just outside Cusco. But Frederick has literally just hot off the press, just won the golden bean, which is the big cheese inside the chocolate world. And he's won it. He won a gold for this one, and he's won it for another bar. But they both are quite similar. One of the styles that Frederick uses is he doesn't use a lot of cocoa butter in his chocolate. So hopefully when you basically, again, do snap it first, you snap it. And then I think all the stuff that basically Anna was talking about, like in this wine, in the way that it's sort of quite delicate, it's quite fresh, etc. The interesting thing about this chocolate is I think you immediately sort of get that. The words that I would have thought when I was basically sort of trying this is that from a textural standpoint, even though it's quite smooth, it's almost sort of a little bit sort of sherbety perhaps, and a little bit sort of citrusy. There's a little bit of sort of bite to it almost. And that I think complements the lightness of the wine, because Anna's absolutely right. You know, tannins either work or they don't work. I mean, that sounds very obvious, but we're going to try some other wines later which will work really well with tannins. And actually, for example, the very first chocolate we had, the Cru Virunga, actually is great with a wine with tannins. But this particular chocolate, I think, works phenomenally well with this sort of light, sort of slightly sort of mentally almost sort of texture and all the other aspects that you've got to it. And just for the fun of it, generally, when we come to basically talking about chocolate, we actually struggle because unlike wine, where you're very good at basically knowing about all the different grapes, it's much harder to do this with chocolate. But actually, this is a rare chocolate where actually we have got some analysis as to what the different, not just the beans are, not just the cacao varietals, but actually literally down to a tree level. So we're actually able to sort of track some of this chocolate actually down to the trees, and they blend it quite carefully to bring across the different permutations. So if you have a look at the slide after the one that we just showed you of the picture of it, what you'll actually sort of see is a rather nice sort of picture of how this is growing. And by the way, as your sort of bonus point for something sort of quite odd, whereas wine grows on vines, as you all know, chocolate grows on trees, but it grows in a slightly wacky way. It actually grows out the trunk of a tree. But here what you've basically got is some interesting sort of profiling of the pulp, which is actually sort of for different trees from the same cocoa varietal in the same village inside Chuncho, which is just outside Cusco in Peru. And it's sort of, you know, it goes by a lot of different names. I mean, a lot of different makers use it, but Frederick, I think, has done a phenomenally good interpretation of actually really giving you the expression of what this bean can do in terms of this sort of slightly sort of citrusy, slightly sort of bright, almost pristine. You do get some of those sort of, you know, mandarin, those jasmine. You do get a little bit of flower, but I mean, if you know what a soursop is, you're doing better than me. I don't really know what a soursop is, but I do think that you do sort of get a little bit of that citrusiness and that sherbetiness, and I think it actually works pretty well against this wine. And by the way, to any of you who have the question of which should I have first, the wine or the chocolate, whatever you want is the basic answer. Just keep dilly-dallying between the two, because I think they work quite well.
Oh, wonderful, Spencer. I have to say, the first thing I smelt was floral, and I can't put my finger on exactly what flower, but it's got this sort of lifted, perfumed is really the word. You know, if I was sort of trying to be broad and cover my bases and hedge my bets, I would call it perfumed. I think more so than any other chocolates.
Yeah, it is definitely more perfumed. It's almost sort of like maybe a sort of jasmine or a sort of a white, I don't know, something like that. You're right, it definitely is. Actually, interestingly, most of the time in chocolate, retronose and orthonose, in other words, the smell and the flavor is actually quite similar. In this case, it is slightly different. So I think that's what you get.
Yeah, I got the floral followed by the sort of citrusy, sherbety, refreshing thing. So yeah, it was lovely. And I have to be honest, so Spencer kindly, I suppose it's part of my job, but Spencer sends me the packs of chocolate, and I have this glorious evening with spread chocolates everywhere and wine bottles open. And Catherine and I love doing these sorts of things. You feel a bit nutty, Professor. You've got spreadsheets of flavors and all sorts of things. But the standout chocolate, I have to say, this particular chocolate was across the board very, very successful with lots of wine pairings. I obviously mentioned it was hard to find the perfect Cabernet Franc, but I was being a perfectionist. But across lots of it's got this lovely fruitiness that actually worked very well with light red wines, just generally, full stop. I think I tried it with a Gamay and a Pinot Noir, and both were still very successful. Those sort of refreshing red wines. So yeah, it's a hit for me.
And just one other quick useful piece of advice, or maybe useless, which is that as you open this chocolate at home, you will probably have noticed that it's incredibly noisy. So even though this sort of cellophane wrapper looks okay, I will let you into a secret. The reason for this is that Frederick is an ex-coffee guy and is extremely environmentally friendly. And so all of his packaging is recyclable, including this, which is made out of cellulose. But do not take it to a cinema. So now that we can all go back to the cinema, this is not a good chocolate for the cinema unless you sort of take it out and put it in one of our Cocoa Runners pouches to take that, because it's very, very, very noisy. But it is environmentally incredibly sensitive and incredibly friendly. So that's the good news to it.
Well, thank you, Spencer. Yeah, I decanted all my chocolates first. But yes, I agree. There's a decent bit of rustling going on. So I think we're keeping good time, which is wonderful. So I can go gladly into the next wine. Now, it's quite interesting with wine and chocolate pairings, because actually a lot of the time for me, the red wines that pair with chocolate tend to actually be on the more affordable end. Now, that's a personal choice. I know that they're not always, that's not always the case. But generally, I often find that the sort of lighter, fruitier styles are the easier pairing with chocolate. Now, Spencer, you recommended a Carmenere, and you said, it goes so well with chocolate, please try it. And I thought, okay, fine. And I tried a few other things alongside it. And I got to this particular wine last. And this was an absolute no-brainer. So it's actually not 100% Carmenere. And funnily enough, it has snuck a little bit of Cabernet Franc in, so around 15% of the last wine we just had. Exactly. So it's from the Colchagua Valley in Chile. So if anybody's tasting along, this is the bottle. I will make a quick point whilst I'm holding the bottle. Coile are an incredibly, incredibly sustainable company. One of the sort of big on biodynamics, etc. Chile in general has a little bit of a problem with heavy bottles. So members, if you are thinking that's not the most sustainable, considering we've just spoken about it, bottle weight, I would agree with you. And it's something the Wine Society are working on with our suppliers. So just as a side note, I recognize it. But yes, so this is 85% Carmenere and 15% Cabernet Franc. Now, Carmenere is a variety that gives a little bit more texture than Cabernet Franc. It gives a bit more plushness, which is great, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I'll just give you a tiny bit of background first about who makes it, where they make it, etc. So I mentioned Coile, the name of the company. It's actually the Undurraga family who no longer own Undurraga, but you might recognize the Undurraga name. They've moved and produced this new project, Coile, and they started it in 2006, originally with a planting of 50 hectares. And that was mainly of sort of the classic international varieties, Cabernet, Sauvignon, etc. And since then, they've planted even more varieties, right through to international Italian varieties like Sangiovese. So they're broadening their horizons. They do make a range of wines, but I would say the area they're really excelling in is Carmenere, in my opinion. They make some incredible Carmeneres. They are higher up in altitude on the Colchagua Valley. So they're about 500 meters above sea level. And what that does is it actually drops the temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius. So we've got a slightly cooler climate, which is going to make sure that our fruits are preserved in a nice fresh style rather than a sort of hot and over alcoholic style. It's also on a volcanic rock, which is absolutely devoid of all nutrients. So the vines really have to fight, particularly in the G2 block where this is from. They really have to fight through the basalt soils and the basalt rock, I should say, to get to their nutrients and their water, which is good because there's low rainfall. So we've got hardworking roots to handle the low rainfall. So we've got a really, really interesting but quite low yielding vine or vineyard here, which means that of course the prices are going to go up a little bit because we're not getting much fruit, but the fruit we're getting is of an amazing quality. And if anybody needed any convincing of the Coile sort of mantra and abilities. Cristobal, who is sort of Cristobal Unduraga, who's the Don, or one of the siblings of Coile, he has worked at the likes of Chateau Margaux, and he really knows what he's doing and has really taken the quality level in Chile just up a notch. So I mentioned those rich plush fruits. I haven't. The Unduragas have put the wine in barrel 18 months. And in 2017, they actually changed the type of barrel that they're aging their wine in. So they've gone for big oak barrels now, so that there's less influence of flavor and more influence of the sort of massaging of those pesky tannins that I do find hard to pair with chocolate. For me, there's black and red fruits, green peppercorns. I won't taste it with you immediately. I'll let Spencer do the tasting with the chocolate. But green peppercorns, coffee, they were all the sorts of things I wrote down. And the one thing that I wrote when I found this pairing particularly pleasant was that the chocolate brings out the spice in the wine. For me, something about this chocolate brought out this extra sort of peppery, spicy fun that the best Carmenere really displays. So it really showed off the wine for me, this pairing. So I'll hand over to you, Spencer, because I'm desperate to try the pair again.
Well, I think congratulations, you've done an amazing job with it too. So, and I think actually just to pick up on the very first thing, which you've now, I think, reinforcing, is that when you're pairing wines and chocolates, the first thing that you need to sort of do is get the texture and basically get the mouthfeel working. So actually, as you open this chocolate, as you look at it, I'm sorry just to be showing you, what you'll discover is that it's got some stuff on the back. Now, this stuff on the back are what are called cocoa nibs. And that's basically what happens after you've roasted beans, you've taken the shells off, and you've cracked them. So this chocolate, and do just try a piece of it, is from an amazing lady called Jenny Samaniego, who is from Ecuador herself, but she lives most of the time in the States. She's an ex-chef. And she is desperate to show the world that Ecuador can produce some amazing cacao from a varietal called Arriba Nacional. And when Arriba Nacional is made well, it's basically, I think that basically Arriba Nacional and Carmenere, the greenness from with what Anna was sort of talking about, this green sort of flavors, these vegetal. When I'm asked to describe this particular chocolate or any of these Ecuadorian from Los Rios, Arriba Nacional, they tend to be sort of quite almost winey. But when I say that, it is the spiciness that you're getting out. And I think, again, though, from the very first point, what you're really trying to get here is the fact that you've got this interesting texture, which comes from adding the nibs to give it a little bit of crunch. So you remember I sort of said when I was describing how the wave works, the first thing on the wave to basically look at is what is the texture of the chocolate? You know, is it smooth? Is it grainy? Now you know what I meant when I said grainy. If you have a stone ground chocolate, it's going to be even grainier, but a lot of chocolate makers introduce graininess by putting a little bit of nibs on top of the chocolate. The other thing I would say is that if you are basically keen on saving the planet, and I'm going to ask just to show a couple of slides here. I'm sorry, I'm not as good at Anna at basically sort of articulating stuff without pictures. So for me, a picture is a sort of an easier way of explaining, especially because we're not all as familiar with chocolate. But if you basically, what you may not be aware of is with chocolate, and in particular with places like Ecuador, is that there is a huge problem in Ecuador with deforestation. And the deforestation is very tragic in Ecuador's case, because what's happening here is what you've got here is basically two pictures. The green, as you can probably guess, is basically the forest, the rainforest, and the gray stuff is basically what's happening when you cut down those rainforests. And this is a picture between 1960 and 1960s, I think it's 1962 and 2018. And what's happened in the interim is very sad, which is that Ecuador has this amazing bean varietal called Arriba Nacional, which has all the notes that we were talking about earlier on. But back in the 60s, various mass makers of chocolate decided that they wanted something which would grow a bit faster and was a bit more disease resistant. It actually is neither of those. But the way they grew it was by cutting down the rainforest and destroying it. And this is, you know, just an absolute tragedy, because what's actually not so well known about chocolate is that you may not believe it, but actually a bar of chocolate like this actually requires about 1.5 to 2,000 liters of water. That's basically your baths for a month and more. Now, this is fine if you've got the rainforest and you're able to recycle it all. But if you haven't got the rainforest and aren't able to recycle it all, the disaster is that you basically not only create desertification, not only create deforestation, but you also create desertification. So for those of you who are, and exactly what Anna was sort of saying, the Wine Society is brilliant. It's focusing on like the weight of its bottles. In the case of chocolate, what you may not realize, as the next slide will show, is that basically chocolate, basically there are very, very few things sort of eating a truly awful hamburger, which are as bad for the environment as actually eating just normal chocolate. So what you really want is chocolate which gives back and actually sort of encourages you to think a little bit about what's going on. And also it's better for you and it's better for the farmers and it tastes a lot better. The other thing I'd just like to quickly highlight is if you look at this bar, it has a slightly strange word on it, which is the word virgin. And just to explain what that means is, in the world of chocolate, there is this sort of like very strange concept of raw chocolate. So for any of you who are great fans of raw chocolate, I'm going to have to disabuse you of the fact that raw chocolate is either nonsense or extremely dangerous or possibly both, because you can't have it. So the definition of raw, as you all know, or what commonly accepted definition is that it means that the seed can still germinate and that it never goes above human body temperature. Technically, you can't do that in chocolate because to ferment the cocoa seed to become a bean, you actually have to raise it above 50 degrees. And you also basically stop it germinating because it turns from being a seed to a bean. So, but forget all that. What generally people mean by a raw chocolate is they mean, well, we haven't roasted the beans. Actually, they will have roasted the beans, but what they will have done, instead of roasting them for 20 to 30 minutes, which is normally what you do, you actually flash roast them for anywhere between 90 to 180 seconds. Now, what Jenny has done is she's just flash roasted this, which actually does bring out a little bit more of the greenness to the chocolate, but she's being very open about this. She's not going to try and make any sort of pseudo marketing claims that it's going to be raw. She's just basically say it's a virgin roast, which means it's a very quick but very sharp roast, which actually lets some of the pyrozones come through. And again, picking up some of the words that Anna was using, chocolate also has a lot of pyrozones, and that's what sometimes gives it some of these sort of green, mentally tree-like notes. But anyway, so I'm sort of going on, but basically congratulations again to Anna, because I love this chocolate and I love this wine, and I think they just go together absolutely fantastically.
Oh, thank you, Spencer. I'm really interested about you saying that obviously some of this is news to me. I didn't know that Jenny produced it with the flash roasting, but those pyrazines, pyrozones, those are really interesting flavors in wine, and they are particularly found in the varieties from Bordeaux, of which Carmenere and Cabernet Franc are too. So yeah, there we go. If we take anything away from this evening, it's that virgin chocolate goes with the Bordeaux grape varieties, or some of the Bordeaux grape varieties. So there we have it. Wonderful. Now we're about to move on to our next pairing. So we're moving away from dry wines. What I mean by that is not sweet wines. I find things quite challenging when it comes to dry pairings with chocolate, because for me, my palate isn't perhaps as forgiving or understanding of. I often taste sweet and then I struggle, and it takes a while for me to get into the chocolate rhythms. I can see that some people are already really enjoying the combinations so far, so I'm delighted. What I would say is I think that the next two wines are probably the easier for novice pairers, in my opinion. And the only reason I say that is it can sometimes be very hard to pair wines with anything sweeter than the wine. And the last two pairings, really technically, that's happened because both of the last two wines have less than 6 grams per litre sugar, so that makes them very dry. The next two wines have substantial amounts of sugar in. It would have been nice to show you something in the middle, and such things exist, but here we are going on to sweet wines. So I will start with the Moscatel De Cebu, which is a beautiful wine. It's quite unusual. If members did order it, I hope that you did receive it in the nice gift box. Again, for me, a really, really, really good value wine. This is from a producer near Lisbon in the Cebu region. And they have been, I love this particularly because I think they had their 100-year anniversary 2 years ago. So they're 102, but it's been handed down by women. So it's always women at the helm of this particular winery, which is lovely. There are around 400, just over 400 hectares of all different kinds of vines on the domain, and they are also supplied by other vineyards that they don't own. So they have huge, huge holdings, but they produce a range of wines, not just a sweet wine. In order to produce this, I say a sweet wine, it's actually technically a fortified wine rather than a naturally sweet wine. So the alcohol is 17 and a half. Yes, 17 and a half. What happens is you produce a wine, a normal wine from Moscatel. So many of you will know the Muscadet grape. So it's very similar. It's a special regional version, the Cebu version, but it's you ferment that wine in stainless steel, and you then add 77% spirit, and that's a distilled wine spirit. And you sort of fortify it to the point where the fermentation stops working. So you halt, I always call it like the weighing scales. So instead of all your sugar being converted to alcohol, what you do is you stop the yeast in their tracks and you're left with high alcohol and high sugar. That's left until the following March. And after that, they take it into oak barrels and mature it for around 2 years. Jancis Robinson described this as a cross between Muscat de Baume de Venise, which is a wine close to my heart from the Southern Rhone, and a tawny port. I do like that description, but I actually just think this is a lore unto itself, this particular wine. It's got sort of caramelized notes, which I think work quite well with chocolate. And I also think it's got some sort of orange, citrus, honey, hazelnut. And I also think if you say it tastes like sugar, I would be okay with that. I think it almost tastes like a cooked sugar or a sugar syrup as well. So for me, it's it almost adds to the chocolate rather than it being a pairing. It's almost, it's almost as if I want to make a sauce out of it and cover the chocolate in it or something like that. But I'll hand over to Spencer because we've got 2 chocolates to pair with this. And I am really excited because they're both very, very different. So I'll be keen to hear what members think of each of the pairings.
So thank you very much. And I'm incredibly grateful again for this great wine too. So the first chocolate that I'd like you to try is a milk chocolate. So for anybody who is lactose sensitive, if you're allergic to milk, cow milk, you cannot have this first chocolate. Apologies, but you will find somebody who will enjoy it. But the reason why we've sort of picked this milk chocolate to go with it is exactly what Anna was sort of saying. So the wonderful thing about a milk chocolate, or a proper milk chocolate it is that it's actually got a lot of caramelized milk in it. So one of the things which people sort of get very puzzled about with chocolate is actually how much sugar is added to it. If you take a dark milk chocolate, which is the next chocolate that we're actually going to have, it will actually have less added sugar to it than most dark chocolate bars. And when you think about this, a normal chocolate bar, so for example, if I go back to the connections, this has only got less than 2 teaspoons of sugar, and you won't eat the whole load in one go. So if you compare it to basically, having a low-fat yogurt, this has got like 1/3 of the amount of sugar of a low-fat yogurt. Even a milk chocolate actually has got very much less than you think it's got in it, because what actually is happening is the chocolate maker is relying on the milk to actually caramelize it. But there is another little trick to this chocolate, which I think actually the wine has got too, which is, to my mind, this, and I'm going to ask for a slide to show you the evidence for this, that this is the reason why everybody should always have a great pudding wine or a dessert wine and some chocolate at the end of a meal. Because you may not be aware of this, but you know how I don't know if you've ever noticed, at the end of a meal, you're completely replete. You've had this amazing sort of, soup, amazing first course, this amazing second course, and suddenly you just feel, I just can't eat anymore. And then, somebody brings out a lovely Sauterne or a lovely Baume de Venise or a lovely Setúbal, and they bring out some chocolate. And suddenly you discover you've got a second stomach. You may not be aware of this, but actually, technically, this is true. You actually do have a second stomach. What actually happens when you see something sweet, you don't even have to smell it. You don't, but it helps if you do. Your stomach will actually be so keen on this that it will actually aid digestion by regurgitating. The pictures that you've got here on the bottom right are basically 2 pictures taken on a Japanese TV show back in 2008, where they had 2 lovely ladies who basically ate loads of lovely food, were pronouncing themselves absolutely pampanga, basically they couldn't eat anymore. And then they took an MRI of their stomachs, and then they showed them some chocolate, or some chocolate cake in this case. And what they literally saw live on TV, and you can see on the MRIs here, is people's stomachs basically digesting extra fast and creating a bit of room for the chocolate. So this is the reason why we would rapidly encourage you to basically always have, at the end of your meal, a little bit of sweet wine and or some great chocolate, because basically what it will do is actually aid digestion, but don't necessarily have too much of it. And if you want to know why the ice cream is the other picture there is a trick that people use to get you to eat lots more. And the trick is most easily explained by this. If you imagine that you go to an ice cream store, imagine that basically instead of getting, 5 scoops of different ice cream, you just get one ice cream and you get 5 scoops of it. Nobody's going to be able to eat all that much. And the reason for this is technically because of something called sensory specific satiety, which means the more of the same thing you eat, the body just gets bored with it. And it's a good way of saying not to eat anymore. But if they give you 5 different ice creams, you will eat more of it. So that's the reason why actually chocolate is much better than a Black Forest Gatto, because a Black Forest Gatto, you're going to scoff lots of it because it's got all these different bits inside it. Whereas basically a good little bit of chocolate and a lovely little bit of setubal, that is the perfect way of just aiding digestion after a good full meal. And hopefully you will also agree that the pairing works pretty well because, again, texturally, lovely and smooth, lovely and silky. But then also you've got a lot of the flavor notes, which should come out the same way. Again, this is Esmeraldas as opposed to Los Rios in Ecuador, where the beans come from. But again, it's a Riba Nacional. It's made in Switzerland by the great Philip Kaufmann and Vera Hoffman. I think it is a fantastically good pairing. I'm going to wrap it on just because I think we're getting close. And we've got a lot more great wines and chocolates to try. And I'm next going to show you a chocolate, which is in a wrapper. And the reason why we've given it to you in the wrapper is so that we could get more of it. And again, do snap it. Now, the good news here is that if you are allergic to cow milk, you can have this chocolate. And the reason why you can have this chocolate is the wonderful Dina from Tossier has basically made it with a buckwheat milk. So, and it actually can't strictly be called milk. So if you've noticed, there is a typo. It's actually not a typo, it's deliberate. The reason why it's spelled M-Y-L-K is that under EU and now UK law, you cannot basically write the word milk on anything which does not contain, the exact definition is something to do with lactating animals. But basically, if it doesn't come from lactating animals, you can't call it milk, but you are allowed to call it milk with a Y. But do try this chocolate. Now, it's going to be quite dark, and but you will still get some of the creaminess from it, and you will get a bit of that bliss point, so you probably will want to go back and have a little bit more of it. And what's happening here is that Dina is using deliberately, not cow's milk, but buckwheat milk. And again, you can even caramelize that to get a little bit of the flavor through this. And again, I think that, again, Anna's done a fantastic job because it brings out that caramelly notes that you get from the wine. And it's just a great fun sort of combination. And if you want the full bar, you can get it. And the one thing I forgot to say is I'm never as good at the Wine Society at this. The Wine Society is always brilliant about explaining how you can buy it and where you can get it. All of the bars we have, which we're tasting tonight, you will get, and we'll send you the details. They all cost between $3.95, and I think the most expensive is $6.95. So they're good value for what it is. But I think it's a great example. And there was a question earlier on from Penelope about. Can I answer it now, or shall I wait?
Yeah, absolutely. No, go for it now.
So I mean, look, it's very difficult, this question. The question here is basically, how do you know that when you're buying chocolate, it isn't using child slave labor or it isn't using a low environmental impact? Candidly, it's really difficult. The only ways that we've found out about it is to actually basically know where the beans come from. Now, everybody on this call is basically a member of the Wine Society, so you all know that basically the Wine Society is the most amazing curator of wines. But you also know that for any wine that you buy, you will know the farmer, you will know the grape variety, you know where it's coming from. And candidly, that's what you should do with chocolate. The 3 things we always advise people to do when they buy a bar of chocolate is, first of all, look at the ingredients. If it's got stuff on it that your grandmother wouldn't recognize, like PGPR, sort of all sorts of wacky emulsifiers. I mean, some of the emulsifiers are okay. So, but basically, if you sort of see lots of soya emulsifiers, just don't touch it. If you see lots of additives, just don't touch it. But this, and if you see sort of palm oil, just don't touch it. So look at the ingredients. If your grandmother wouldn't recognize it, don't eat it. And then the second thing is, look at where it's made. It is extraordinary. You can basically take a bar of dairy milk and you will not be able, I'm sorry, you can take any supermarket brand. You will basically not be able to define 2 different things. You will not be able to find where the beans come from, and they won't be able to tell you where it's made. So basically, do what the Wine Society do. Know where it comes from, know who's made it, know what it's made of. So that's my honest to God answer. We sell over 1,000 different bars. We never sell a bar unless we know not just how it's been made and who it's been made by, and we've gone to their factories either by Zoom or some other way, but also we insist on knowing where every bean comes from in terms of the co-op and the farms where it comes from, because that's the way to get the best flavor, as with wine, but it's also the most environmentally and ethically favorite way to do it.
Thank you, Spencer. That's fabulous. Yes, I mean, knowing sort of your farmers and knowing where things come from is such a huge part of both our businesses. So it's why it works.
But you are brilliant at it. I mean, just a quick aside. Look, I mean, I've been a member of the Wine Society literally since I went to university. It was given to me as a present when I left university, and I mean, it's just brilliant to learn about wine from them. And you know, the stuff that you do, all the pages is just amazing. So it's wonderful, and we emulate as much of it as we can.
Oh, thank you. In terms of the pairing, I found that really interesting, Spencer, because the more you talked about sort of the milk being a bit darker and perhaps less caramelized, I found that the cow's milk, i.e. the Esmeralda Spa, sort of added maybe a little bit of, for me, that's where the caramelized flavors really work together. Whereas the buckwheat milk, when I tasted the wine after that, I actually found it was more marmalade-y, almost it upped the sugar level in the wine more. And I felt the wine got more sort of rich and indulgent, and it really did feel like I'd sort of dolloped a bit of marmalade on top of the chocolate. So it was a really fascinating pairing. And I did see one member say, "This is my chocolate." I think they were talking about the Esmeraldas. But let us know if we will do a poll at the end, but I'd be keen to see where the members had a preference, because I think probably there was more of a marriage in the first pair for me, but the contradiction of the second pair was really fun because it did more to the wine. You know,
I think texturally as well. Again, back to, you know, the great thing, which I think you're fantastic at, is getting the textures to match and even contrast very interestingly. And I think the texture of the buckwheat, actually Dina is phenomenally good at creating amazingly smooth with a beautiful snap. And in this case, she's really done something very different, because the buckwheat, when you put it in the conch and you grind it, you can't get some of that graininess out. And I think it goes beautifully with the silkiness. It's that contrast.
Michael said it's the Moscatel is lovely with the buckwheat as well. He's also asked recommendations on keeping the wine now that we have an open bottle. You'll be pleased to know that keeps incredibly well. Oh, there we go. Catherine's just answered. It will last for at least a week in the fridge if you can keep your hands off it. Do you know what? I'd probably say 2 or more. I think Catherine's probably giving you an official. I'm giving you the non-official answer. If you keep that in the fridge with the stopper in, and it does have a lovely sherry stopper, so you don't have to worry about corking and uncorking and all that rubbish. Pop the sherry stopper back in, you've definitely got 2 weeks. But exactly like Catherine says, if you can keep your hands off it, and like Spencer says, it's a lovely little treat at the end of the evening. And exactly as Catherine says, it makes a beautiful long drink with tonic. So that's quite a Portuguese thing to do, to pop some tonic in there. So give it a try. Last but not least, in the wine front, we have one of my absolute favourites. I love this wine. I love it as much for the label as anything else. For anybody tasting along, we're now onto the Wise One Tawny from Bleasdale. A cracking wine. I actually used a Bleasdale wine earlier this week in another tasting about old vines. And the reason is that Bleasdale was started by a gentleman called Frank Potts. He was a gentleman from Portsmouth. And he, Roger's just said, I thought my camera was off. Don't worry, we haven't spotted you there, Roger. I often think it's a good present for on Father's Day, that particular wine, for that reason. But yes, so Frank Potts started Bleasdale Winery, and he started it in the 1850s. And he was from Portsmouth originally, moved to Australia, and it's actually, Bleasdale is the second oldest winery, only after Urubamba. So they're the oldest winery in Australia. For anybody who knows anything about wine history in Australia, originally a lot of Australian wine production in areas they thought might be too hot, or just actually by the very nature of where Australia is, and the fact that it was a long travel to get there. Lots of people would have traveled on long ships to get there. There was a huge tradition in fortified wines. And it wasn't really until World War II that Australia even really started making wines that weren't fortified. So this particular producer, Bleasdale, would have specialized in fortified wines when it first started, i.e. the wine we've just had was fortified, that addition of alcohol or the addition of a spirit in order to quite literally fortify and strengthen the wine. And they would make them in styles that they were used to. So Frank Potts from Portsmouth would have drunk tawny ports. And so this particular wine is an emulation of a tawny port. Now, they can't call it port, so they've very intelligently called it tawny. And the tawny element is to do with how it's aged. Interestingly, it doesn't really use port grape varieties in the sense that we might consider them. It actually uses, I think it's Grenache, Shiraz and Verdelho, which is a Portuguese grape variety, but mainly grown in Madeira. But the tawny element is the fact that they've aged it in old barrels. So it doesn't quite taste like a tawny port in that sense. It's slightly different, I would say, almost like a Maori that's been aged in barrel, if anybody's familiar with those sort of southern French fortified wines or made with Grenache. But essentially, this is an homage or an ode to the old traditions. They never stopped producing fortified wines, but most of their production does now go into still wines. A fun fact as well, before I hand over to Spencer, well, I'll do a little tasting as well, but a fun fact that the name Bleasdale, I believe Frank Potts had a sense of humour. There was a local reverend, and I will read you the quote, called Ignatius Bleasdale, and he advocated, and I will have to read it word for word, sorry, a sober wine drinking community that excludes ardent spirits. And so Frank has sort of got a big sense of humour and likes a bit of irony. So he thought naming a fortified wine after an anti-temperance priest was a good idea. So he named the winery Bleasdale. And I like to think that his sense of humour lives on with the wise one tawny. So yes, in terms of flavours, there are similarities to port, like I mentioned. So we do get the red fruits, that nutty, chocolatey. A lot of that nut and chocolate does actually come from the oak aging. So 10 years average age, it's a mixture of vintages, but 10 years average age will give you those. It also makes the texture very silky, which I think is a real bonus here. It's kind of caramelized. It's got a lot of those sweet things, but I would say on the nose, it's not overly sweet. There is some vanilla, but there's kind of a more of a nutty aroma that we certainly didn't get in the last wine in this one. So I'll have a quick taste and then I'll hand over to Spencer. It's got some great freshness, but that nuttiness does come through. That sort of rich, it's almost dark chocolatey now. We're talking about dark chocolates and nuts. It's also beautifully high in acid. My mouth is salivating. Verdelho's got great acidity, so it's a lovely food pairing wine. So I'll hand over to Spencer to talk us through the final two chocolates, which I'm hoping is, I'm hoping members like this pairing. This was probably our boldest pairing, I'd say. So it's a fireside warmer pairing for me.
This is definitely a tricky pairing, and I'm actually going to start it in a slightly strange way. If you've all got a glass of water, now I'd actually like to ask you, after having had the amazing tawny, to grab a glass of water. And the reason why I want to do this is that I actually want to sort of see if I can get the tannins out of your mouth. So grab a glass of water, give it a quick sip. Hopefully you've got most of them out. And then I want you to be very brave. I want you to grab 100% chocolate. So for those of you who've never had 100% chocolate, if you've had the glass of water, this is going to be quite fun. So 100% chocolate, first of all, just do smell it and do snap it. Smell-wise, again, you get a lot of the chocolatey nut stuff. I'm hoping I get a little bit of woodiness. I get a little bit of, also, I know what's coming, so I'm going to get a bit of citrus out of it. But just try a little bit of this. And then, unfortunately, you can't all see one another. But if you're looking at your partner or anybody else with you, just basically have a look. And especially if you've had the glass of water, what should happen in about 5 to 15 seconds is you're going to actually understand something which all of you great wine drinkers have all forgotten about, which is actually what astringency does to you. Astringency is not a taste or a flavor. What it actually is it is the result of tannins binding with the proteins in your saliva. And for a lot of you, if I can just see the next page, this is what I think you will be looking like. Yep, is that how you feel? Now, the wonderful thing about wine, and you get this from coffee too, is that tannins are actually nature's way of warning you, perhaps, that the food isn't right. And so if you have an unripe banana, it will be the same way. If you have a wine, again with tannins, and this wine actually has not just lots of acidity, which also helps you because it gives you the juiciness, so it gets your saliva going again. It's also got tannins. Now take a little sip of this lovely, amazing tawny port, the wise one. And try the 100%. And what should suddenly happen is your brain is saying, okay, I know that I've just basically had some tannins and I'm going to switch off my sense of astringency. You can also replicate this with a coffee bean. So if you don't believe me, you've all got in your packs 2 of these 100%. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up, grab a coffee bean, try the chocolate, and then basically chew a coffee bean or just basically have an espresso, and then try a bit of the chocolate. And what should suddenly happen is that you should suddenly be able to start developing the flavors. This is a Madagascan cacao. You should get some sort of almost berry notes from it, some nutty notes from it, but it should be very, very, very approachable. And the reason why this has happened is because you have managed to knock out the astringency. Now, there are other ways of knocking out the astringency, and I'm going to move on and basically slip all the slides, but if you want to sort of know more about this, hopefully Anna will invite us back, and if not, you can come to one of our Cocoa Runners tastings, and we'll talk a little bit more about not just the environmental aspects of chocolate, but also some of the social and the sort of political stuff about labor and poverty and all that sort of stuff. But what I'd love you now to try, if you can, is the Cru Virunga again. So that was the very, very first chocolate that we tried. And hopefully you've got lots of these to keep going with. And on the front of it, it's got a picture of a mountain gorilla because it comes from the Virunga National Park. So any of you who've seen the great sort of gorillas in the mist, the stuff with Diana Fossey, you'll know that's where they come from. And it comes from the DRC, the Democratic Peoples of Congo, on the borders of Rwanda and Uganda, etc. It's made in Switzerland by the great Philip Kaufman and his lot. And actually, as we're all eating this, you'll be pleased to know that you're also planting a tree in the rainforest. But what I hope you get from this is that it's an Amelando, so it's a different cacao varietal to the Criollo you had in the last one. But because it's got some sugar added to it, it knocks out the astringency. And again, I think it actually works very, very well. The chocolatiness of it actually go brilliantly with what Anna described as the chocolatiness of the wise one. So 57. So we're almost going to get there in time to basically do the questions and not run out of time. So I feel that I've talked enough.
No, that was great. And I love the experiment with the 100%. We had to use a 100%. It's great fun. And we've had somebody say that it's like eating black coffee. And it really is, isn't it?
It's tannins. And you guys with wine, do you remember as a kid when you didn't like the Cahors or the Tannat or any of those wines? I mean, tonight you picked some amazing wines which don't have a huge amount of tannins, and you've managed to pair them. But tannins, human, it's our natural reaction. It's astringency. We don't like astringency, but you can switch it off once you get used to it.
And it's nice, you spoke about the tannins in this old wise one, tawny, and the tannins and the tawny are actually coming from a couple of different places. And one of the places that they're coming from is the oak. And so you can actually get oak tannins as well as grape tannins. And the long oak, sorry, that doesn't make sense. The long tannins strings, so they polymerize in wine, and they create these long strings that are much easier to taste. And one of the reasons that you age very, very, very tannic wines in oak is, yes, okay, they impart some tannins, but actually what they do is they make those chains so much longer that it's easier to deal with them. Because quite rightly, Spencer, if you had, say, a tannat, surprise, surprise, the most tannic grape variety, or one of, if you had a really, really tannic, very macerated glass of tannat, it can be unpleasant. It can be too much. So there are methods that we've got round in wine for actually producing a wine that makes a polymer and ensures that they are easier and less astringent to digest. So there we have it. There are so many crossovers with wines and chocolates, which I love.
And you should all have them at the end of a meal because they aid digestion.
There we go. So I think we've answered all of the questions as we've gone, Spencer, which has been absolutely fantastic. The one thing I'd like to mention just quickly before we do the poll at the end, and I'll say something on that too, but what I would quite like to mention is you did say earlier about having sort of good quality chocolate and buying up, really, I suppose, is the way I describe it. The one thing that, since our very first Cocoa Runners session with yourselves last year, we have made active decisions to buy chocolates based on all of the things that you have said this evening. But it also means that you enjoy your chocolate more and you don't wolf it down. And I think there's something really lovely about that. And, you know, a bar like this would last me a week, with a little square or two each evening. And because they're so full of flavor, you don't need much more than that. So if you've got your Moscatel De Cebu in the fridge and you're sort of slowly dipping in for a little glass, either as an aperitif or afterwards, after dinner, then lovely. You can sort of do the same with chocolate, which I really like. Doesn't need to be wolfed down.
It's savouring, not scoffing. I mean, it's what everybody knows in wine, that, you know, you don't buy a wine for the alcohol, you buy it because it's this extraordinary concoction of flavors and sensations and stories, and you just want to savor it. And that should be the same with chocolate too. And it should be the same with chocolate spreads too. James, if you write to me afterwards, I'll send you some great chocolate spreads to have a go at. We do sell some, and there are some other ones that you can get too. We've actually supplied cacao powder to a couple of people who are very good. But yes, no, I mean, the links are great, and, you know, we have so much to learn from you lot, that it's fantastic to be here and doing it.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. Before we go, members, as well, before I send everyone away to go and indulge for the rest of the evening, but I would just like to quickly do a poll, because we'd love to know, for those of you who have the wines and the chocolates. I would mention that we tasted the final two the other way around this evening. So for wine 4, we did the 100% first and then the 70%. So Spencer and I aren't allowed to vote. So if the poll has popped up and you did have the wines and the wines and the chocolates this evening, please do vote. Oh, we can see some votes coming in. I'll just give it a couple of more seconds. I'm really glad as well. We've had people joining from all around the country, it seems, on the chat. So thank you very much for joining us. It has really been a pleasure. Oh my, they're coming in thick and fast now. Right, I think we'll probably have to call it a day there. 3. I bet there's some arguments going on, Spencer. We should probably allow people 2 screens, shouldn't we?
We should definitely sort of basically let people go there too. But what a fantastic
absolutely. Well, the good news is, members, that absolutely every single pairing this evening has received votes. Just, and I mean just, pipping to the final at 25%. In fact, I'll tell you what, I think I can show it. There we go. If I share the results now. So 25% was wine 2, which was our Carmenere, which was great with our connection bar. Absolutely fantastic. But closely followed by wine 3 with the Esmeralda's milk. So 2 quite different combinations there, which was a real treat. So thank you, members, for joining. Thank you for voting as well. It's always helpful for us to understand how good our pairings have been as well. But thank you, huge thank you to Spencer. Thanks for giving up your evening, for sorting all these wonderful packs for all our members. It's always fascinating to talk to you. You're such a sort of flavour guru, and it's lovely to be able to think about wines with you, and think about how flavours work with food and wine matching. So thank you very much.
Well, the thanks are to you, to Anna and to Catherine. I mean, it's always fantastic to do this, and, you know, not only amazing wines, but amazing pairings. Thank you so much, Anna, and well done. And just, like, you know, all of you guys who are out there from the Wine Society and from Cocoa Runners too, you know, chocolate and wine just doesn't get better as far as I'm concerned. It's just, you know, cheers.
Couldn't agree more. Cheers. Thank you, everyone.